right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. There may be a few more people trickling in, but seems like a good time to start. Welcome back. This is our second session on New Testament. We'll be doing a series of 8 sessions on New Testament this new year, and I'm going to do, I can't remember if it's the first 3 or if it's 3. I know I'm doing the first 2. This is the second. And then I'm doing another one, but I can't remember when it is, on the parables. And then we'll have others coming in, guests from other schools around the area and so forth like that to focus on different topics. But, I'm supposed to say something about the sound. Yes, the new members, the Inquirers class that Clover back there is leading is happening right on the other side of that screen, and we're just starting to learn how sound travels or crosses through that barrier from one direction and the other. There's not much we can do about it, but we might. I think there are almost 40 people in the Inquirers class, which is great. And I hear they're a great bunch. Clover had a really great day with them yesterday. So we'll see how that works. But I am Tim Beal. I'm married to Clover, and I am a professor of religious studies at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland. So we live in Denver, but I work there still from back when we used to live in Cleveland, and I commute every other week or so back to Cleveland for that. But I'm glad to be with you all again. Last time we did a brief introduction to the New Testament as a whole, and this time we're going to zero in a little more closely on the Gospels and talk about them in a little more detail. And this is meant to be, no previous experience necessary, no prereqs or anything like that. And I started last time with a song by King Missile, Jesus Was Way Cool, a wonderful song. And I'm not going to play this, and I'm not even going to sing it, I don't think. But that's from Jesus Christ Superstar when they're doing the Last Supper, and the apostles are singing, always hoped that I'd be an apostle, knew that I would make it if I try. Then when we retire, we can write the Gospels, and they'll all talk about us when we've died. So I love that. And they sing it in this kind of melancholy way while they're all having a picnic communion. But anyway, that's the scene, actually, come to think of it, that you're looking at right there. So we will talk a little bit about what the Gospels are. What are the Gospels, the ones in the New Testament? Talk a little bit about how it's clear that the Gospels and the way they've been collected together in the New Testament really respects and values differences, even contradictions among them. They don't all say the same thing. And then we'll talk about a particular puzzle that's kind of interesting to think about. It's called the Synoptic problem, and I'll explain that in a little more detail when we get to it. So what are the Gospels? This is the most content on this particular slide, but first of all, the word gospel, it comes from the Middle English word Godspell, which is where that other musical gets its name, Godspell. And Godspell in Middle English is, G-O-D there is not God, it's good. And spell is a word that means something like story or news or message, mostly story. So Godspell means good story or happy story. And that's a good translation of the Greek word for gospel, which is euangelion. You can see there in italics. The EU in angelion is happy, good, pleasant. It's where we get other words like... what am I thinking of? Euphoria. Euthanasia means happy death. Thanatos is death, and the EU in front of it is that, or good or happy death. And then the other half of that, angelion, what does that sound like? Angel, right? And angelion also means messenger or message. So an angel is a messenger, and you can treat it as a person or the message itself. So euangelion means happy or good message. So we're going to have a little extra credit experience here. Want you to find the word euangelion. It's going to be in Greek in this case. In this ancient Greek manuscript, which is actually from the Codex Sinaiticus that we talked about last week, which is one of the earliest full Christian Bibles that includes a whole Greek Old Testament as well as some texts, some apocryphal texts, and also a whole Greek New Testament, plus a couple texts that are not in the nowadays New Testament canon. Anyway, I'm going to have you look for euangelion there in that manuscript, and then also we're going to talk a little bit about what's called nomina sacra, sacred names, and we'll see the nomina sacra for the name Jesus Christ and also for the phrase Son of God. So here is a little bit of that manuscript, and I'm going to try to, I said last week I'm so used to overhead projectors, that's how old I am, that I'm used to being able to point at things. I might need to get a laser pointer or something. But so this is the upper left corner of the start of the Gospel of Mark. Right above the white writing, you can see a K-A-T-A there. And then it's a little harder to read the other, partly because Greek capitals are different from our alphabet in how they look. But that right there says kata on the upper left in the manuscript, which means according to or something like that. And the word right to the right of it is markon. So that's kata markon, meaning according to Mark, the gospel according to Mark. And this is the first verse of the first chapter of Mark. And I have it a few different ways, but the main body of I need to remember the microphone. The main body of the text is under that white writing. It looks to you like probably like an APXH at the front there. So that's actually Greek capitals for RK. In our alphabet, AR, X or K, E. That thing that looks like an H is a heta, and it makes that sound. So RK. Anybody know what RK means? You can kind of guess almost, like archaeology and archive and past, or like beginning too. So past, origin, beginning, something like that. So here I think probably beginning is the best translation. So RK, and then you see what looks like a TOY. The large capital Y looking thing in Greek is a U. And so that's RK2, and you notice there's no spaces, right? You just have to know where one word stops and the next word begins. RK2, so the beginning of, to is of the, and then there's your word right after that. It looks like an EYA something something, those are gammas, EL lambda I. So euong, two G's together in Greek make an NG sound. So euangeli, and they don't bother worrying about spaces or line breaks, O-N on the next line down. Or O-U, I'm sorry, euangeliu, because it's in the genitive form. So that is beginning of the euangelion, and then here is the nomina sacra. You see what looks like an IY with a line over the Y, and then what looks like an XY with a line over the X and the Y. So this is called a nomina sacra, and certain divine names or special names or epithets are put in this way, and it's the first letter of the word and the last letter of the word with a line over it to indicate there's letters in between. And so that what looks like an IY with a line over it is Iesu, that's Jesus in that case. So of Jesus, and then the next one, can you guess what the X with a bunch of letters in between ending in U might be? I think you know it because I probably wrote it somewhere. I didn't. But there it is up above in the nicely printed version of the Gospel of Mark. Iesu Christou, right? So that's the short version of Jesus Christ. And then, kind of interesting here, and we might have some time to come back and look at this. I don't know if we will or not, but maybe. Can you see there's like some little writing that's sort of inserted up above the bigger text? That is, and I wrote it up above, UU and then a theta and a U. I couldn't get a theta to print in a Prezi for some reason. So UU, that would be huiu, which is son, and theou, God. So what you have is Jesu Christou huiu theou, Jesus Christ, Son of God. But it's interesting that whoever was writing this manuscript put that in smaller text. And if we have time, we might go and look at some details, but it's probably, in part anyway, I'm speculating really because I haven't studied this, but if you look at other manuscripts of the Gospel of Mark, some of them have that and some of them don't, that extra phrase, Son of God. And some of them have a different phrase too. So it could be that the scribe sort of inserted that in a way to indicate less certainty about whether it was part of the main text or not. And then it goes on from there. Kathos, let's see, the gropta, let's see, I shouldn't try this. Anyways, the writing, as was written by the prophet Hosea. And then it goes straight into the quote from Isaiah. That's at the beginning of the Gospel of Mark. So now you've actually seen what it looks like, and you can identify that, and have learned a little bit about what these manuscripts look like. If we have time, I said before, maybe we'll go back and look a little bit more detail about that. It might be interesting to you. So there are 4 Gospels in our New Testament canon meaning our official list, authoritative list or something like that. And 3 of those Gospels are called the Synoptic Gospels. Syn means together, S-Y-N, and optic, seen together. So they're very similar, and you can line them up and compare and contrast them, and they include a lot of the same content, and then they're also different in other ways. We'll talk about that too. And then the 4th Gospel is the Gospel of John, which is very different in many ways from the 3 Synoptic Gospels. These were not the only Gospels that were out there, that were written and that were circulating and were popular among early Christians in the Jesus movement. There were many other Gospels. There also, as we mentioned before, were oral traditions that circulated for decades before any Gospels were written down. These oral traditions included stories and sometimes maybe collections of sayings of Jesus or teachings of Jesus. We can say that in part because we have one surviving text called the Gospel of Thomas that is only sayings of Jesus. It doesn't include any stories or narratives or anything like that, and there could well have been others too. And then I think it's interesting and important to keep in mind that Paul's letters, they come after the Gospels in our New Testament, right? But Paul's letters were written decades before the Gospels were written. We talked about last week, middle of the 1st century, whereas the Gospels at the earliest probably date to around 70 and after. And Paul, it's pretty clear, never read the Gospels. Doesn't seem to know their stories, doesn't refer to them, doesn't quote teachings of Jesus from them, or anything like that. So that's interesting to reflect on as well. The surviving manuscripts of the New Testament, you've seen one, very important one, the Codex Sinaiticus, which dates to the 4th century. The surviving manuscripts and also just little fragments, tiny little pieces of manuscripts, there are something like 5,300 of them in the Greek language alone, and that doesn't count Latin and Syriac and other languages that also include early manuscript evidence of these Gospels. Actually, I think it's 5,300 Greek manuscripts of New Testament manuscripts and fragments that date, but none of them are as early as these Gospels were written, right? So the manuscript evidence we have, the fragments and the pieces of Gospel and Paul's letters and other things like that, and sometimes whole versions of them, date from the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries, and later than that. So we're talking about a century removed, probably in most cases, at least, from the time of Jesus, and close to that from when the Gospels were written. So we're looking at manuscript evidence that probably is copy of copy of copy of copy of some original text, right? And so when you have that kind of manuscript evidence, and so much of it, you won't be surprised to find that there are lots of differences among the different manuscripts, right? We call them variants. And some of these are very, very significant, completely different endings to the Gospel of Mark, for example, and so forth like that. Yes?
Tim, I've been ruminating about this fact, because I've been less than 60 years of being a Christian, that Gospels were written after. But certainly Paul was aware of the story of Jesus. So I've been ruminating on
Right.
what's the difference between,
Yes.
the Gospels and knowing the story.
That's a good question. What's the difference? Paul doesn't seem to know the Gospels, doesn't quote them, doesn't cite stories from them, and yet had to have been aware of some parts, at least the crucifixion and resurrection. He talks about that, right? But it's an interesting question how much of the material that the Gospels include Paul knew, because there are just no references to those kinds of stories and actions and sayings and teachings. Have this mind among you, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though equal with God or whatever, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but poured himself out and became as one of, that's the Philippians Christ hymn, which seems to be a piece of liturgy that tells the story of the incarnation, of letting go of power, and being crucified as a criminal and being raised again. So there's that much of the gospel story there. But yeah, it's an open question what else and how Paul encountered Christ and became a Christian, and what he knew, because he also was connected with these disciples who were with him. And I mean, that is reasonable to think that you would know some stories from those relationships. So it's an interesting question. Thanks for bringing it up, and we'll have more opportunity to talk about that. Yeah, I don't think we'll leave the Prezi now, just to make sure we have time to get through everything. But if we do, if you would like to, and I can kind of show you how what they're called text critics are the scholars that look at all these manuscript data and evidence, and they try to figure out what they think might have been the most original of the different versions based on these later manuscript quote-unquote witnesses is what we call them. But I want to instead focus on a couple other things first. One is that these four Gospels, which are different from each of which is different from the others in important ways, tells us something, which is that our New Testament canon values differences, and even the Gospel writers seem to recognize differences. And so we talked a little bit about this last week, but want to just focus on it a little more closely right now, because it's such a revealing text at the beginning of the Gospel of Luke. And remember that Luke's Gospel actually has two parts. It's Luke and it's Acts. Even though they're separated in our New Testament, they are definitely a part one and part two of the same story. In the first one, they're both addressed to this Theophilus, and the one, is the story of Jesus, and then the other is the story of the apostles going forward and the spread of the church, and Paul, and the spread of the gospel to Gentiles and so forth like that. But this is the beginning of the Gospel of Luke, and it's just it's an important. I think it's valuable for us in thinking about the ways in which the Gospels value differences, and even, I would say, contradictions. So it's a long sentence. That's all one sentence. So get ready to do your, what did we used to call that? Diagramming. I didn't learn to diagram until I taught 12th grade high school, and then I had to learn Since many have undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed on to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, I too decided, after investigating everything carefully from the very first, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the truth concerning the things about which you have been instructed. All right, we'll take that apart. First of all, as we talked about last week, none of the Gospels, all of the Gospels are anonymous originally. The names that are attached to them, in this case Luke, and Matthew and Mark and John, were attached to them much later in history and tradition, and probably their attachment to these important early people who were with Jesus helped lend authority to them and maybe helped them make it into the canon in some way. But this, like the others, is an anonymously written gospel. So since many have undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events that have been fulfilled among us, all right, many have tried to write down an orderly account. And the word behind orderly account there means something more like a narrative, a stringing together of details into a narrative shape. So first of all, this writer, we'll say she, is acknowledging that there are other orderly accounts out there, other narratives about Jesus that are already out there. Since many have undertaken that, just as these events were handed on to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. So this is referring to, before writing down orderly accounts, the oral traditions that were shared from those who were eyewitnesses, those who were there with Jesus, to the day when they started getting written down later generations by non-eyewitnesses. So since others have done it, just as and others were picking up and working from oral traditions, doing their research that way. And then I too, she said, decided, after investigating everything carefully from the very first, all of those other narratives, all of these oral traditions, doing the research, I decided to write an orderly account. It's a different Greek word. I don't like that the New Revised Standard Version uses orderly account twice with two different words there. But anyway, this one is something that means more like an orderly account or an ordered presentation or something. For you, most excellent Theophilus. So this is the audience, the reader for this, which may be an actual person named Theophilus, or it might be a kind of a name to use, because it means, so theos and philo, so it's lover of God, something like that would be what that name means. But this is the addressee, so that you may know the truth concerning the things about which you have been instructed. So, I mean, there it is right there. This gospel writer knows there are other written gospels out there, knows that they also did their research based on the written and oral sources that are out there. And this person is saying, I'm going to do that too, and basically implying mine's not going to be the same as the other ones, right? Because if it were, why would you do it, right? I think I have, an account of this that I want to share that is different from the other ones that are out there. So that's about valuing differences, valuing even contradictions. And we have a New Testament canon that includes 4 different gospels in it. It doesn't include all of the gospels that were out there, but it includes 4, and these 4 are each different from one another. So I think that's something for us to sort of keep in mind and meditate on as we think about what the New Testament is. Is it trying to be univocal of one voice with itself, or is it actually almost like a collection of perspectives and stories that we have some freedom to play with and engage with creatively as we do our own interpretive work, our own making meaning work? So third, puzzle time. Just work with you and kind of present to you a brief little puzzle. that New Testament scholars like to engage and solve in different ways. I teach at a school that's very STEM heavy. A lot of my students are engineers, and they like these kinds of things. It's good to put these little puzzles out and just have them come up with their own solutions to them. It's really fun. And a lot of times their solutions are very similar to the ones that scholars have come up with over the centuries, actually. So here's the problem. It's called the synoptic problem, right? So it is a problem that pertains to those three synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The problem in a nutshell is that these three gospels, the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are very similar yet very different. So why is that the case? How are they related? Another way to think about it is, what's the genealogy? Which one comes from which? And are there other sources too that might be part of that equation? A little bit fuller explanation of that synoptic problem. Matthew and Luke, and they're much longer if you've ever stopped to kind of pay attention to that. Mark is very short, very terse, no infancy narratives, for example, and has a kind of almost staccato-like narrative storytelling form. It just jumps from thing to thing to thing very quickly and is very tight and compact and terse. Matthew and Luke include almost all of Mark, but they often appear to correct or revise Mark's version. We could look at these, but fixing quotations that Mark made that were actually quotations from two different scriptural texts instead of from just one, and Mark put them all under one, and so forth like that. And Matthew and Luke also share a lot of sayings of Jesus. Almost all of what they share that's not in Mark are sayings of Jesus with each other that Mark does not include. For example, the Sermon on the Mount or the Sermon on the Plain. It's on the Mount in Matthew, it's on the Plain in Luke, but it's, blessed are all of that and the Lord's Prayer and things like that we're familiar with. Finally, Matthew and Luke each includes material that is unique to itself. So Matthew has its own special material that's not in Matthew or Mark. Luke does, and Matthew includes its own material that Luke and Mark don't have, right? So there's the basics of the puzzle. And so how might we try to solve this puzzle? And I'm just going to throw three different solutions that are hypotheses that are out to you for you to kind of think on and reflect. And we can talk more about them, or you can come up with your own, or we can talk about other things. So there's the two-source theory. I'll zoom in on each of these. The two-source theory, the four-source theory, those are both fairly similar. The Farrar-Goodacre theory and the Griesbach hypothesis. So first, the two-source theory, which is I guess in some ways the simplest, which is that Mark, being shorter and being included in almost entirety with corrections in both Matthew and Luke, was a source for Matthew and Luke. So Mark up there fed into both Matthew and Luke. The stuff that's in Matthew and Luke that's not in Mark comes from what's called Q. And Q is short for Quelle, which in German means source. And so it's just a name that means what it says. Another source of gospel material that was a similar to the Gospel of Thomas in that it was a collection of sayings, because what's included in Matthew and Luke that's not in Mark is mostly sayings, right? So that would be the simple two-source theory. It leaves out some things, as you're probably already aware, because you say, Tim, you also said there's stuff unique to Matthew that's not in Luke and Mark, and there's stuff unique to Luke that's not in Matthew or Mark. And so this is the four-source theory, which is essentially the same as the two-source theory, but pointing out, Luke also, there was also some proto-Luke material, like, for example, different birth and infancy narratives and stories about Joseph and Mary and so forth like that. And there was a proto-Matthew as well that brought different material in to the Gospel of Matthew. So that's essentially the four-source theory, but just also acknowledging that there were other sources that Luke and Matthew were using. This one is a little different. The Farrar-Goodacre theory that Mark influenced both Matthew and Luke, but also Matthew was earlier than Luke and was a source for Luke. It solves some of the same overlap problems in a different way, but it's separating them out, in terms of their historical origins, saying that Matthew was earlier than Luke, and so Luke had both Matthew and Mark to draw from. It removes the need maybe for a Q, right? And there's a whole, I have to tell you, there's a whole field of scholarship on Q. And Q it's a hypothesized text, but it has chapters and verses. And you can go to scholarly sessions of the Society of Biblical Literature and watch somebody give a paper on Q chapter 4 verses whatever, because they have worked this out in tremendous detail. So that's the Farrar-Goodacre theory. And here then is another, the Griesbach hypothesis, which puts Matthew first, Matthew then influencing Luke, and Matthew influencing both Mark and Luke. So by that hypothesis, Mark would somehow be a kind of a condensation in some ways of these fuller Gospels. There's a whole lot of politics around this. You may know that it's only in the Gospel of Matthew that Jesus says, "On this rock I build my church," which has been important for the Catholic Church since Peter was the first pope, and the lineage of popes starts with Peter, who was the rock on which the church was built. There was a whole political conflict related to culture wars in Germany in the 19th century. At one point, there was a requirement that theology students adopt the hypothesis of Markan priority over Matthean priority. This was a very anti-Catholic time in German history, so these kinds of theories about Matthew first versus Mark first actually have played out in some powerful ways during that early Kulturkampf, that early culture war of the Second Reich, and so interesting stuff around that. So those are the four that I would share with you. There are others, probably. I'm sure there are many others, but the four most common ones, and that's really my basic introduction to the Gospels. Do you want to look briefly at the text critical stuff? Okay, let's try that. I have to pull out and go to a different program. So this is, it's going to be impossible to read now that I think about it. I can enlarge that and enlarge this. There, it's a little better. Right, yeah, you can kind of see. So this is a program called Accordance. It's really handy. I didn't have it back when I was learning Greek, but I'm happy to take advantage of it now. If you look in the upper left there of Mark 1:1, you'll see Arche tu euangeliou Iesu Christou, and then you see the huiou theou, Son of God. We saw those as nomina sacra, just two letters with a line over each of those words. But do you see how huiou theou has brackets around it in the upper left there? I can do this. Yeah. This here. And the brackets around it. So if you click on that, it'll pull up this over here, this stuff, right? And these are notes on the different manuscript evidence. So in any academic version of a Greek New Testament, you'll have a Greek text on the one side, which is basically the product of a committee that has looked at all of these many manuscripts of this gospel and has basically constructed what they think is their best guess at what the original quote-unquote Gospel of Mark might have been. But then they include all of the notes so that others can look at those and see whether they agree or not. And so here they've got a bracket around that to kind of raise it as a red flag. And when you go and you look at the text notes here, these symbols, what looks like a cross and an X and a theta, these represent different important manuscripts that are often cited. And so what it's saying here is that these manuscripts and this one here, the one that looks like an alpha, that is the Codex Sinaiticus. They all go with this huiou theou included in the text. And we saw how it was, right? It was little, and it was inserted up above the larger text, but it's included there, and so they say that. Others have huiou tu CWRU. CWRU from kurion means Lord. So there it would be son of the Lord, right? So other versions have, and then tois prophetes. This is later. This is a different note coming on later on down here, right? So then we keep going down, and I should not be doing this on the fly because I'm going to get it all. I'm going to be guessing, and there's videotaping this, so I'm going to get fired. But yeah, so kathos, as was gig. That's what I was trying to read in the manuscript. Gigroptai, as was written. Graph. Grop is related to graph, graphane, graphic, that's word for writing. In the Isaiah the prophet, if you look over here, others have in tois prophetes. Now that might have been a correction because we talked earlier about this is actually a quotation from two different prophetic texts. And then it goes on from there. The ego, is right here. This right after the idu, which means look or something like that. You've got that little T there, and that is over here saying that some have ego. Look, I am sending a message, an angel, and it goes on like that, right? So that's a little bit of a window into what we're looking at. And you saw the manuscript evidence where you saw that huiou theou, Son of God, already kind of indicated in that manuscript as maybe an addition. And here you don't see that. You would have to go and look at all those manuscripts and work it all out and look at the visuals of it too to see how it was handwritten in and so forth to sort those things out. But that's just a little bit of a quick window onto that kind of thing. And I'll try to find my Prezi again, and we can talk from here. But so that's it. We've got some time to talk. Yes.
So can we use the mic?
Oh yeah.
Let's use the mic because
Okay.
we're live streaming. Hold on just a second.
Thank you. So I'm just considering the fact that all of this that we're looking at and that we've been talking about is in Greek.
Yeah.
And are there any of them in Hebrew?
Are there any early manuscripts, gospel manuscripts in Hebrew?
Yeah.
Not surviving, but there was one, and we know because it gets talked about in other early historical texts. I can't remember. I think probably Eusebius talks about it, and others. Again, this is not my field, so I have to be careful not to get too specific about where. But there was an awareness early on among early Christian writers of a Hebrew gospel, which probably would have been Aramaic Hebrew, because that would have been the lingua franca, and it would have been a Palestinian, a Judean gospel text, and some argue that was probably a Hebrew version of Matthew, of what we have in Greek as Matthew. But most of our, what we have for the most part is, as this diaspora of Christianity spreads, is these texts in other languages: Greek, Latin, Syriac.
And one more, sorry. Does that have anything to do with the rate of literacy?
I have no idea if it has to do with literacy or not. I mean, a lot of the reason we have a Septuagint, remember we talked about the Septuagint, which is a tradition of Greek translations of Hebrew scriptures that is very, very early. The reason we have that is because lots of Jews were reading Greek and were speaking Greek. Yeah, I'm not sure to what extent. I'm sure there are those out there who could talk more about how literacy relates to the different languages and translations. Augustine, late 4th century, early 5th century, knew the Bible in Latin. And mostly orally, basically kind of had it memorized, and that's, that's how it was circulating. It wasn't circulating as a written text that people sat and read silently to themselves and studied in that way. But by the time you get to Jerome, who does the Vulgate, the Latin Vulgate translation, it's because so many people spoke Latin and it was necessary, but it was also, according to Jerome, necessary because there was just such a mess of different Latin versions of the Bible all over the place, and so Jerome wanted to go and he was a linguist and knew other languages, and he wanted to look at the Hebrew and the Greek and these Latin versions and try to sort out what should be the standard Latin version of the text. But lots of different versions of the Septuagint circulating, no doubt. We have evidence of some of those. Last week when we looked at the synagogue story in Luke 4, where Jesus reads from Isaiah, that Isaiah in Greek doesn't look like any Septuagint version that has survived. It's different from those, so that too is evidence that there just were a lot of different versions in a lot of different languages out there.
So I don't quite know how to express this, but we've all heard you speak. Many of us heard you speak before. This idea that the Gospels were written 60 years later, and Paul, it's like whoa, really? And I guess what I'm asking is this accepted or understood across Christianity today, or in more conservative churches, fundamentalist churches, would this be like complete heresy, all the things that you just said? Because, isn't that more like, no, Jesus spoke and they wrote it down and it happened, and
right,
for word the way, and this is why, the Bible is the Word of God, and we were all there, and just
right,
all the things that you've said kind of is like, well, wait a minute, what is this Bible anyway?
Yeah, right.
So I guess that's what I'm asking is this like the fringe sort of view, or is...
No.
Everybody here.
Yeah, for me, in the worlds of sort of, mainline Protestant seminary, mainline denominational seminary, this is basic New Testament intro stuff for the most part. But I would say that, among responsible scholars, there will be a range. There will be debates, for example, about whether, for example, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus are actually Pauline letters or whether they're pseudo-Pauline. And I said I think it's pretty clear that they're pseudo-Pauline. That is, they were written in the name of, as if they were by Paul, but they're not. They come from a later time. Others, scholars will argue that they are, and will make a stronger case for basically the New Testament as tradition has given it to us. These are Paul's letters. They have his name on them, and that's right. These are the Gospels. They have their names on them, and those are accurate, whether it says it in the Gospel or not. John wrote this one, and he was the beloved disciple, and et cetera, et cetera. So there can be arguments like that, but those are going to be evidence-based arguments. Then you've got, of course, we talked a little bit last week about authority and the inerrancy, the idea that the Bible is without error of any kind and without any contradiction. And there are many, many, many preachers out there and scholars out there who would make that argument. They have to kind of bend over backwards to do it in all kinds of ways. And so, for example, we talked about Paul saying all Scripture is inspired by God and blah, blah, blah. And of course, Paul's writing a letter to somebody saying that. He's not talking about his letter, which wasn't Scripture for anybody at that time, nor was he talking about the Gospels, which hadn't been written yet. He probably was talking about the Torah and the prophets. But yeah, so, and same with that, if anyone adds or takes away from this at the end of the book of Revelation, people will cite that saying, therefore, you can't do anything to the Bible because the book of Revelation is at the end of a Christian Bible now, but that's not what that John of Patmos was talking about. He didn't know there was ever going to be, he didn't know there'd ever be such a thing as a codex, for one thing, that could hold all of these things in it. So and you know, we could go on about some of the gymnastics, intellectual gymnastics that some will go through to argue for inerrancy and non-contradiction. For example, a famous one that I remember because I grew up in cultures that were more leaning that way, was how Judas died. So in the Gospel of Matthew, Judas feels remorse after turning Jesus over, throws the money away, and goes and hangs himself. And then in Luke Acts, he takes the money and he buys some land and he's on it and he trips and gores himself on a rock. It's kind of like a divine justice story, and dies. So one's suicide, deep regret, one kind of killed by an act of God after buying something with the money. The one I remember was in the Charles Ryrie study Bible. Ryrie is still alive and kind of a famous inerrantist. And his theory was called the weak tether theory, which is that he did hang himself, but it was a weak tether. It was frayed. It broke. He fell, and he was stumbling around, and he gored himself on a rock. So they're both true. Yeah. So, you know, I mean, yeah, you have to try pretty hard to maintain that. Or another argument that has been around for many, many years among text critics is that while the versions we have are not without error and not without contradiction, there's an original behind them that actually is without error and without contradiction. Originalism, kind of an argument. I think scholars like B.B. Warfield in the previous earlier centuries, or at least earlier century, was, you know, an advocate of that argument. And a lot of people who lean more toward inerrancy and so forth become text critics because they care about these details, these textual details, and they want to fix it, they want to solve it and figure out how to hang on to that. Bart Ehrman, some of you know Bart Ehrman, wrote a book called Misquoting Jesus, and then he's written many other books since. He grew up liberal Episcopalian. He talks about this in most of his books. Grew up liberal Episcopalian, became a fundamentalist, went to Moody Bible Institute and places like that. And then eventually his research on text criticism led him to walk away from that fundamentalist Christianity. So there's a whole range out there, and there are certainly responsible, solid scholars who would argue more toward the traditional than I am here, and many of them would argue that behind all of these variants there are originals that don't have the same problems. My personal view is the further we go back, the more variants we find. I think there's evidence of that in the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's the earliest manuscript evidence we have of Hebrew scriptures, and there are different versions of Jeremiah and different, texts all collected in these caves with clear differences. So it could be that the further we go back, the more differences we find between the manuscripts. Yeah, Larry.
Tim, it's easy to see why Case Western won't let go of you. You're making me very curious. As you were just saying, maybe find more stuff as you go back further. Mm-hmm. Did Jesus just not like to write?
He wrote in the sand, in the dirt once. We know that, right? I have no idea if Jesus knew how to write, but read.
It makes absolutely no sense to me that this a 12-year-old kid is reading.
Oh, yeah.
Scripture.
And arguing with the rabbis,
arguing with the rabbis, but he doesn't know how to write.
Yeah. No, I'm being a little bit facetious about that, and he did write on the ground one time in one story, but it's just we just have to
look at.
What?
We have no text to look at.
No, we don't. Yeah, this was a kind of a backwater movement, and it didn't get a lot of media attention, as we talked about last time. So no photos, no news articles about this phenom, and some argue that maybe disciples and other followers might have kept notes of the sayings, because I think there's some evidence of rabbinic teachers having followers that would do something like that. In philosophical circles, something like that, could happen too, which would be a way of preserving some of the teachings. But yeah, unlike Joseph Smith, we don't have a text written by the teacher. Yes.
I'm going to go back to heresy for a minute.
Okay.
So you mentioned the other Gospels. There are lots of other Gospels, the Apocrypha and the Gnostic Gospels. And so what I think about sometimes is how do we square our desire to know what Jesus truly taught in this broader sense with the big four that ended up in the New Testament that we spend all of our time focusing on?
The big what? The big
the
four.
big four.
Yeah. Not everybody does do that. Good question. If your quest is really for the words on the lips of Jesus, as the phrase used to be, then maybe many would want to spend a lot more time, for example, with the Gospel of Thomas. And we've had, I'm suddenly blanking on her, Elaine Pagels, who's a friend and colleague, has done so much work around that. In some ways, I would say her sort of spirituality is very much informed by Gospel of Thomas and some of these other Gnostic traditions that she's worked so hard to kind of recover and recuperate as part of the Jesus story. I think at the same time, this desire for the arche, the archive, the origin, is a lost cause in some way. What we have is a living tradition, and we have this inherited collection. And I agree with you. I'm interested in these other non-canonical texts and what I can learn from them, and how they can, also deepen my own religious life and my own faith life and so forth. But we also, within this tradition, have this kind of inherited canon that we are in some sense called, together to engage and interpret together and make meaning from, so that, there's a kind of burden of freedom on us to make meaning from this, because we don't have some origin that we can anchor it all to and not have the responsibility for interpretation. Eric and I were talking before, and I think this will come up a lot in the course of this series, but just the importance of interpretation and meaning making, and the range of different meanings people make and have made out of these traditions over the many centuries. I think that's something we have to talk about. But yeah, for me, that gets to, for me as a religious person, that gets to this issue of freedom. We don't always want that. But we have it. There's a wonderful story I'll end with, because I can see it's 10:30, and some of you probably know this story. I've written about it too in this book, Rise and Fall of the Bible. But it's called The Grand Inquisitor. It's in Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov, and it's often circulated as like a short story. The two brothers are arguing, and one tells this story, and the story is set during the time of the Spanish Inquisition, and in the middle of all of this stuff happening, there's a dead girl in the piazza of this town, and this man walks up to her and heals her and brings her back to life, and everybody realizes it's Jesus who's returned. And immediately the Grand Inquisitor, who is watching, has him arrested and imprisoned. And the rest of the story is a conversation. It's not really a conversation. Jesus never says anything. They're in the jail, and the Grand Inquisitor is talking to Jesus and explaining to him why he did that. And he says, you came, basically in a nutshell, he says, you came to give people freedom, but what they really want is bread and miracles. They want to be told what to do, and they don't really want that freedom. And so tomorrow we're going to burn you on the funeral pyre, and all those people who were cheering for you yesterday or today will be cheering for your execution. And I think, as I recall, I haven't read it in a while, but somebody was nodding, I think Jesus gives him a kiss And that's maybe the only thing that happens. But do we really want freedom? Is that what we want from religion? And part of that freedom is the freedom to, is the requirement to make meaning from this material that doesn't just give itself over in obvious ways in terms of what it means. And so I think that's a calling for all of us and an invitation. I'll stop there. Thank you.